Welcome to Military Analytics. The Ukrainian war took its place in the pages of history, not only as a land war, but also as a very comprehensive war, as an air and naval war. With the entry of the winter season, the intensity of the land attacks of both countries decreased. This was because the ground was muddy and it was difficult for war vehicles such as tanks and armored vehicles to advance on the ground. Instead, both countries relied on missile and UAV stockpiles. Russia, in particular, carried out missile attacks through its Navy forces. The Russian Black Sea Fleet and the Russian Navy forces in the Azov Sea launched missile attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure facilities and civilian settlements. But Russia's naval strength began to gradually decrease from February 2022 when the war began. It's a well-known fact that Russian President Vladimir Putin attaches great importance to naval power. He has told you that he has recently taken initiatives to increase his presence and power, especially in the Baltic and Arctic seas. This is because Putin had a Soviet education and Russia inherited Soviet naval power. However, the Russian Navy has difficulties in showing its effectiveness in the Black Sea. In recent days, the number of ships in the Russian Black Sea Fleet has decreased. Let's now look at the details of the withdrawal of the Russian Navy from the Crimea and the Sea of Azov. Ukraine has been hit hard, especially because of Russia's attack on the Black Sea Fleet. Infrastructure facilities were destroyed and civilian settlements suffered massive destruction. In order to cover this destruction and damage, the Ukrainian army embarked on a number of operations in order to end the presence of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. Within these operations, 16 Russian ships, including the Russian flagship Moskva, were destroyed by the Ukrainian forces. Apart from these 8 attack boats on the Dnipro River were also destroyed by the Russian forces. As of last weekend, 6 Russian warships remained in the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. No missile carriers were detected among them. In particular, 5 Russian warships in the Black Sea and 1 in the Azov Sea are ready for battle. Russia had 17 warships, including the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. The exact whereabouts of the other 11 ships is unclear. Some Ukrainian officials assume that these 11 ships are headed for the Georgian coast. Another claim is that they were taken into care in Russian ports in the interior of the Azov Sea. The exact fate of these ships is unknown, but it is known that they did not land in the Mediterranean. Russia's naval group has reduced its presence in the Mediterranean to 7 warships, including a total of 20 caliber-type cruise missiles and 3 missile carriers. Since contemporary great powers are capable of quickly turning crisis into conflict, U.S. foreign policy demands that U.S. military forces be prepared to take advantage in warfare. These forces are likely to increase interoperability with partner countries, as foreign partners in Europe or Asia will have geographic reach and have special military capabilities that complement that of the United States. Russia's war with Ukraine, which began in February 2022, presented a rare opportunity for the United States to assist Ukraine in its defense against attack in the maritime field. The U.S. Navy helped implement modern naval denial in the Black Sea, with the European U.S. Navy working with Ukrainian coastal defense forces. The U.S. has also leveraged maritime alliances to improve access. From a strategic perspective, it has helped seasoned planners understand what a war between Russia and US/NATO forces might look like, and has opened up new opportunities to build future advantages against Russia by reinforcing its wartime advantages, increasing interoperability with partners, and strengthening alliances. The U.S. Navy can increase its readiness for great power conflict. So what advantages gained here? As Western forces withdrew from the Black Sea after the Ukrainian war, the Russian Navy quickly established local naval control of the northern part of the seas around Crimea. In the first 48 hours of the conflict, the Russian fleet launched about 100 caliber long-range cruise missiles from both the Black and Caspian Seas to take down civilian and military targets in Ukraine. Moscow later expanded its kinetic employment to include coastal defense and air-launched cruise missiles. From Kiev's perspective, gaining an advantage over the Russian Navy was beyond the capabilities of the much smaller Ukrainian Navy. But things began to change gradually, with the Russian Black Sea Fleet conducting tactical combat operations against Ukraine in close proximity to its NATO partners. The United States had to develop its combat fighting capabilities to support competition. Beginning in March 2022, As policy changes allowed the U.S. Department of Defense to provide weapons systems and intelligence for operational employment. Specifically, the U.S. Navy sent Ukraine Harpoon coastal defense missiles, enabling Ukrainian Navy forces to develop maritime area awareness through information sharing mechanisms. In parallel, the UK provided Ukraine with a variety of weapons systems compatible with operational intelligence using new capabilities in the Sea of Azov. Ukrainian forces struck and damaged the Russian Alligator LST in March, sinking the Russian Slava-class cruiser Moskva in the northwest of the Black Sea, forcing the Russians to withdraw from their naval outpost on Snake Island near Odessa. As Ukraine's achievements increased, Russia's sea distances in the Black Sea increased over time. Ukraine's operational employment resulted in the interruption of maritime traffic along its coastline, and the Russian Navy complicated its planning efforts against future targets in the northwestern Black Sea. As a result of their increasing coldness, operational capability, development and integration into the naval environment helped the Ukrainian Navy's defense of Odessa by reducing the Russian offensive action. Ukraine's refusal of Russia's control of the Black Sea prompted the World Food Programme in July to resume grain exports, which supplied 40% of the wheat supply and helped avoid a world food crisis. Through naval weapon systems, information sharing, and logistical resupply efforts within maritime borders, the U.S. Navy has provided combat advantages to Ukraine, which has since defined modern sea denial. So besides these advantages, how did the Ukraine partnership get better? Throughout last year, the Russian army used concentrated force to attack Kiev's sovereign territory and threaten Ukraine's Westphalian lines. Faced with aggressive and sustained Russian combat operations, Ukraine sought interaction and operational alignment with the West. Given Ukraine's history with and proximity to Russia, the U.S.-Ukraine operational relationship was largely based on trust. Ukrainian coastal defense forces communicated frequently with U.S. naval forces early in the conflict, providing operational coordination in Odessa against Russia's control over Ukraine's naval approaches. Over time, direct information sharing procedures enabled tactical success and the ensuing combat advantages. The core component of trust has made interoperability between the U.S. and Ukraine a reality that produces tangible operational results. Evidence can be seen in the changes in the operations of the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Navy around the Crimea. In addition, Ukraine directly allowed U.S. forces access to the Black Sea and gave direct naval warfare advantages over Ukraine's naval approach. After more than a year of war in Ukraine, Russia's Black Sea Fleet has been put on the defensive as U.S.-Ukrainian interoperability increased in volume and scope. NATO provided Ukraine with specific support that strengthened Western nations and mobilized the alliance, in particular from the beginning of the conflict until October 2022. More than 40 countries provided Ukraine with more than $97 billion in financial, humanitarian, and military aid. While Russia's military aggression was designed to threaten Western dominance and weaken the foundations of the NATO alliance, it had the opposite effect. The interests of the West were quickly aligned and brought closer together over time. The U.S. Navy's success in giving its Ukrainian partners a war advantage teaches important lessons by activating the fire of partnership, improving interoperability, and strengthening alliances. It is possible to create distinct advantages against the much larger and more capable Russian naval forces. A support for the Ukrainian war effort was purely developmental. However, it has shown that with the right partners, communications infrastructure, and assets allocated before the crisis, U.S. support can be a decisive factor in conflicting great power competition. So what you guys think about this issue? Tensions in the Mediterranean, Black Sea, Arctic, and Atlantic seas continue to escalate in the shadow of the war in Ukraine. U.S. commanders and military observers are sounding the alarm about the activities of Russia's submarine fleet thousands of miles off the U.S. coast. At the same time, U.S. coastal security has been sounding the alarm about Russian warships and spy ships recently appearing off the coasts of Washington and Hawaii. There is no border violation in the Atlantic or any dangerous attempt to create an environment of mutual conflict. However, considering the current situation, the activities of the Russian Navy at a distance of less than 1,000 miles from the U.S. coast are enough to put the U.S. Navy on the alert for coastal security. Let's take a look at the U.S. Navy's approach to Russian Navy submarines and warships and the activities of the Russian Navy at close ranges to the U.S. coast. As Divine Justice, we strive to bring you the most striking news as quickly as possible. By working hard day and night collectively with our expert staff, you can support us by subscribing to our channel. Throughout the war, which began when Putin launched a full-scale invasion of neighboring Ukraine last February, Russian Navy forces have accumulated in the Black Sea. The presence of Russian submarines on the U.S. coast and in the Mediterranean is also increasing, according to officials. The Russian Navy commands one of the most diverse submarine fleets in the world. Some can carry ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, which Moscow sees as the key to its strategic deterrence. For this reason, this increase observed in the USA and the Mediterranean coasts is of serious importance. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia has been working to develop its submarine fleet, especially in the last few years. Moscow has produced a fleet of submarines capable of hitting the most critical targets in the US and continental Europe. In this regard, Putin stated that his country will build more nuclear-powered submarines that will ensure Russia's security for decades to come. There are indications that nuclear-powered submarines are being deployed off the coast of the United States and elsewhere in the Mediterranean and around Europe. According to Michael Peterson, director of the Russian Institute for Maritime Studies, which studies the Russian military, these Russian deployments that Peterson mentioned are reminiscent of the Soviet-style submarines in the Cold War. On the other hand, the U.S. Northern Command and head of NORD's U.S. Air Force General Glenn Van Herk warned of the increasing presence of nuclear-powered Severodvinsk-class submarines on U.S. coasts. Van Herk described Russia as the primary threat to the country at the moment. According to Van Herk, the Russians first moved the Severodvinsk submarines to the Pacific. Another sub is currently in the Mediterranean and another one is heading towards the Atlantic. This could be a persistent, imminent threat that could carry significant numbers of ground attack cruise missiles that could threaten the U.S. in 2021. Van Herk described Russian submarines as equivalent to domestic submarines in terms of silence. For this reason, the head of NORD argues that the situation should be prevented as soon as possible so that the Russians do not operate quietly in the seas. US Navy Vice Admiral Andrew Woody Lewis told the U.S. Naval Institute and Center for Strategic and International Studies think tank that the growing presence of Russian submarine activity in the Atlantic Ocean means that his service no longer considers the East Coast. We've seen a growing number of Russian submarines deployed in the Atlantic, and they are more capable, deployed longer, and equipped with more deadly weapon systems than ever before. The U.S. Navy is also strong enough not to be underestimated. In addition, the U.S. Navy is currently undergoing a modernization move. The U.S. fleet has a total of 64 submarines, including 50 nuclear-powered attack submarines. Their job is to support ground operations and carrier groups and conduct surveillance, according to the nonprofit Nuclear Threat Initiative. In addition, the United States began construction in June 2022. The new SSBN, the largest and most advanced Columbia-class nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine. 3 of the country's most powerful attack submarines were reportedly deployed by the U.S. Navy in July 2021. The U.S. Navy has deployed the most secret U.S. submarine, the Ohio-class SSBN in the Arabian Sea. Russia, on the other hand, did not hesitate to make a move against all this. The Admiral Gorshkov frigate, armed with Zircon hypersonic missiles, advanced towards Washington. The Russian frigate, Admiral Gorshkov, essentially the first warship converted to use Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles, has been spotted moving towards the east coast of the United States. Judging by the data from open sources, it's now claimed that the Russian warship has already crossed half the Atlantic Ocean, and this has seriously worried Washington since the launch. Range of Zircon missiles can reach 2,000 kilometers. The Admiral Gorshkov guided missile frigate was under close surveillance by NATO naval forces during its maiden voyage. This surveillance actually occurred after the Royal Navy intercepted Gorshkov and his Navy force earlier this month as they crossed the English Channel. More recently, the Russian ship was being tracked in the Atlantic by the Portuguese Navy and was expected to surround Africa. But radar surveillance sites suggest Admiral Gorshkov made an unexpected maneuver. A compelling report on the subject suggests that the Russian frigate has left the escort tanker Kama in the Bay of Biscay and headed west. There has been no official statement from the Russian Ministry of Defense on this matter, but if the information provided by British journalists is correct, in the coming days, the Russian frigate may approach Washington within striking distance of hypersonic weapons. The U.S. Coast Guard reported that it was tracking a suspected Russian spy ship in international waters off the coast of Hawaii as tensions between Washington and Moscow continued due to Russia's war in Ukraine. The Coast Guard noted that the situation is not unusual, but is being closely monitored. In the statement shared by the U.S. Coast Guard, it was frequently observed that while foreign military vessels could freely pass through the exclusive economic zone of the USA, foreign-flagged military vessels were operating and navigating within the intervention area of the Coast Guard Zone 14, according to international customary laws. This was not the first time suspected Russian spy ships have been spotted off the coast of the United States. In 2019, a Russian spy ship was spotted off the southeast coast of the U.S. by 2 U.S. officials, and this Russian ship was observed operating on an unsafe route. The actions of this Russian surveillance and spy ship, Viktor Lenov, sailing off the coast of South Carolina and Florida, were determined to be unsafe as it did not use flashing lights in low-visibility weather and did not respond to attempts by merchant ships to communicate to avoid it. Following the detection of this Russian ship, the USCG said in a statement that it continues to coordinate with DoD partners, provide updates on foreign ship movements and activities, and meet availability appropriately to promote international maritime norms. After the USCG statements, the danger of Russian spy ships in the seas continued. But the USA did not turn a blind eye to the Russians on this issue. The U.S. Coast Guard tracked another Russian intelligence ship sailing near the Hawaiian coast again, according to the video released by the U.S. Coast Guard. The ship was determined to be the Vishnya-class intelligence ship Karelia. Satellite photos showed the Russian ship approaching 40 kilometers, or about 25 miles from the Hawaiian coast. Pentagon Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh announced at a press conference that the Coast Guard continues to monitor the ship. The Pentagon did not know why the Russians were taking the ship near Hawaii, but Singh said it was completely precarious timing attached to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to investigate this matter. The unit is working with the Department of Defense to monitor ship movements and, if necessary, provide additional U.S. presence in an area where a foreign military vessel may be navigating. On the other hand, Russian intelligence ships had sailed near Hawaii before, while the Coast Guard followed Karelia in May 2021. At that time, the ship was sailing in international waters and was not dangerous for navigation. However, with the increase in tension and danger in the seas in recent days, the situations have started to change considerably. Only the USA and its allies are expected to make a daunting move against Russia's steps that may pose an element of danger. Experts on this issue stated that the USA and its allies should do more activities in the high north to deter China and Russia in agreement between senior naval officers from the 3 countries and a National Security Council official. He acknowledged that the physical presence of allied navies and coast guards is becoming increasingly important as Russia strengthens its military presence and China expands its intentions beyond trade in high northern waters. These measures should be taken as soon as possible for safer maritime borders, and the expansionist policies of the Russians should be prevented in the seas. Russian President Vladimir Putin has made life hell for millions of people. That's why there are millions of people who have great enmity with Putin. Some of them even manage to harm Putin. So why do people turn against Putin, and how do they harm him? Let's take a look behind the scenes. Russian President Vladimir Putin has fought wars in many regions throughout his life as a Russian intelligence agent, as a minister, or as the president of Russia. He has influenced these wars. Putin has caused millions of civilians casualties in these wars, especially among Chechen commanders. There was a great anger against Putin. The conflict between Russia and Chechens continued for many years. Under Putin, the repression against Chechens increased. Chechen places of worship were raided and many Chechen citizens were killed. Chechen fighters started their rebellion against the Russian army. In these clashes, the Russian army suffered heavy damages. However, Putin had many Chechen commanders killed and continuously supported Kadyrov. Kadyrov soon became the head of Chechnya and began to cooperate with Putin. This further enraged the Chechen rebels. After Kadyrov and Putin cooperated, many Chechen fighters were forced to flee their country. But these fighters wanted to continue fighting against Putin. That's why thousands of Chechen fighters traveled to Middle Eastern countries. There, Chechen fighters fought against Putin-backed armies. But after the start of the war in Ukraine, the Chechens decided to go to Ukraine to win a bigger victory against Russia. In fact, There was a battalion of Chechen soldiers in Ukraine since the beginning of the war because some Chechens had settled in Ukraine after Kadyrov came to power. After Russia's aggressive behavior against Ukrainians, Chechen fighters mobilized. Chechens joined the Ukrainian army and started fighting against Russia. Chechen soldiers from Syria also joined these battalions. This caused a great panic in Russia because Chechen fighters were very experienced against the Russian army. Russian soldiers are constantly fleeing in the face of Chechen brave operations. The unit of Chechen soldiers is called the Sheikh Mansour Battalion. At the head of this battalion is a commander named Muslim Shabalov. In an interview with Shabalov made important statements to the Turkish press. Commander Shabalov stated that they see the war in Ukraine as a continuation of the war in Chechnya. He emphasized that Chechens joined the Ukrainian army to take revenge on the Putin regime. Shabalov also spoke about Kadyrov. Kabalo said that they do not accept Kadyrov, who fought alongside Putin as a Chechen. He emphasized that all those who cooperate with Russia and attack innocent people are enemies. Muslim Shabalov's statements aroused great interest in Chechnya. Chechen citizens started to react more harshly against Kadyrov after these statements, but the biggest development took place in Syria. Chechen commander Abdul Hakim al-Shishani, one of Putin's biggest enemies, decided to go to Ukraine. Shishani, who has a great influence on Chechens, went to Ukraine and made a statement here. Shishani said, "We are going to Ukraine to fight the Russians who killed our people in the 1990s and committed the most heinous crimes against them. Russia continues to use violence against anyone who is hostile to it. Kadyrov was a Russian agent, is helping Shishani." Statements caused a great panic in the Kremlin because Shishani makes very effective speeches, raising the courage of the soldiers and influencing the course of the war. Shishani is also very successful in terms of combat techniques in the war between Russia and Chechnya. The Russian army lost thousands of soldiers as a result of Shishani writes. Now Shishani is going to Ukraine with his strongest men, which worries Russia. Shishani is allegedly in the Luhansk region with his troops. The Russian army is suffering heavy losses in this region. Shishani soldiers have special methods of warfare. These soldiers manage to advance very quietly, especially at night. A small number of Chechen soldiers dressed in camouflage clothing sneak up on the Russian military base surrounding the military base. The Chechen fighters launch a sudden raid. First, smoke and gas bombs are thrown through the windows of the military base. Smoke bombs were also thrown into the ventilation system of the bases. Realizing that they were under attack, the soldiers began to evacuate the military base in a great panic. The Russian soldiers running out in a panic are easy targets for the Chechen fighters. Chechen fighters first drop bombs where the soldiers are located. After the bombs, the sniper starts shooting to Russian soldiers one by one. Hundreds of Russian soldiers die as a result of a raid by only 20 soldiers. Russian soldiers are now constantly afraid to sleep in their races. The number of sentries at Russian bases had been increased even more, but no measures can stop the Chechen fighters. Chechen fighters continue to advance quietly and carry out successful operations. Many Russian soldiers are trying interesting solutions to protect themselves from these attacks. Many Russian soldiers put their weapons next to the bed before going to sleep. Russian soldiers are also practicing what to do in case Chechen fighters launch a raid. So far, however, none of the drills have helped Russian soldiers survive these raids. The Chechens are completely changing the course of this war. Since the day he took office, Putin has been constantly harmed by the Chechens. This is driving Putin's crazy. Putin is furious with Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya. The Kremlin has given Kadyrov millions of dollars worth of support in order to cooperate with the Chechens. Kadyrov gained more support among Chechen politicians and became the Chechen leader. But Kadyrov was not successful in getting the Chechens to pledge allegiance to Russia. Chechens have never forgotten Russia's oppression of them. This is causing a crisis between the Kremlin and Kadyrov. Putin wants Kadyrov to have more influence over the Chechen people, but Kadyrov is quite unsuccessful in this regard. On the other hand, Kadyrov soldiers are constantly causing problems for the Russian army. Chechen soldiers joining the Russian army do not listen to the orders of the commanders and disrupt all order in the army. According to reports in the Russian press, Kremlin officials prepared a report to Putin on this issue. According to the report, Kadyrov should no longer be supported by Russia. Russia will try to ensure the support of the Chechen people by supporting other politicians in Chechnya. But Kadyrov does not want to allow this. The problems caused by the Chechen soldiers have backed Putin into a corner. Putin knows that it cannot postpone this problem any longer, but at the moment it is not known what decision he will take. Putin's decision about the Chechens will affect the course of this war. If the Ukrainian army succeeds in this war, the history of Chechnya will change. Chechen commanders who fought in the Ukrainian army will return home and become leaders. This could result in Chechnya's independence from Russia. What do you think about the Chechen resistance against Russia? How do you think the arrival of Chechen fighters from Syria and Ukraine will affect the course of the war? How do you think the conflict between Putin and Kadyrov will end? Do you think the Chechen struggle for independence will resume?